Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. This is Rappler Talk. Joining me today is a man I totally always enjoy talking to about the future of news. His name is Gautam Mishra. He is the CEO and founder of Inkle based in Melbourne. Gautam, thanks for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Maria.
So, Rappler just partnered with Inkle to bring Inkle into Manila. And, the man behind this, the guy who's talked, always made sense about the future of news has been Gautam. So, let's talk to him about what he sees, right? So, tell me, Gautam, you were the strategist for one of the largest news groups in Australia, Fairfax Media. What have you seen in terms of how the business of news has changed over the years?
I think, it's a great question, Maria, because obviously news is one of the most rapidly changing, most widely disrupted industries out there. So one of the challenges really is just the pace at which that change at which that change happens. But one of the things that's really interesting about the industry is I'm one of the few people who probably is very optimistic about the future of news, because I actually think that publishers today are much more in control of their destiny and are much more confident about their future than they've ever been in probably the last 20 years. If you think even just 2, 3 years ago, the publishers really weren't sure which direction to go in, whether to emphasize ads or subscriptions, and whether they should accept the overtures coming in from Facebook and Apple and Google and various other people who are also asking for content for free distribution. And now, when you think about publishers and the position that publishers have taken in the industry, this is actually probably one of the most positive times that the industry has faced certainly in the last 10 years.
I mean, it's great that you're saying it's one of the most positive times, but most other news managers I know are like tearing their hair out because, they don't know whether they go to Apple News or they go to Google or Facebook, and then the monetization that you get back from the tech platforms is actually very, very small, certainly not enough to support a news group. Well, I guess, why do you feel optimistic about it? What's the opportunity that you see?
The opportunity is exactly in what you said. It's in realizing that no one else is out there to save the industry, that it is not Facebook's job to save the news industry, that they're not actually going to be able to save the news industry even if they wanted to. And so publishers need to stop expecting and hoping and wanting these other platforms and these other organizations to play that role. And the fact that you see news organizations around the world actually making that call and saying, you know what, we're going to take charge of our own destiny. The New York Times, puts out this very bold plan, says we're going to get to 10 million subscriptions. We've got 2 million today. We're going to be a profitable enterprise. The Independent in the UK is profitable. The Washington Post in the US is profitable. So, this really is a unique moment because none of these things have happened in the last 10 years. So it's really in the last 12 months that I think the industry's really turned the corner.
And something has happened. Let's put it in the context of what's happening globally in terms of news, right? I mean, this is also the time when there's great uncertainty. It seems like there's a global pendulum that has swung back towards more authoritarian types of leaders. We're certainly in a situation like that. The era of fake news. I mean, from what you've seen in terms of journalism and the role of news in society, how do these dovetail into each other?
It's really fascinating, actually, because again, it's actually the first time in the history of the news industry that the industry's problems are actually well understood by the consumers of news, and that are cared about by the consumers of news. Because the disruption that's been going on in news for the last 20 years, for the most part, readers have been relatively immune to that, the effects of that disruption. It's only now in the last year that it's become a real problem for consumers. And a good parallel to this is the way the global financial crisis played out in the States. The subprime crisis was brewing, and the quality of underlying real estate investments in the States was deteriorating for a long time, long before it started to impact homeowners and the broader market. And it's only when these things start to impact the broader market that you can actually get to a point of correction and find a new equilibrium. But so I actually, again, I accept that there are a lot of very troubling things that have happened in the last year because of fake news, because of the problems with this, I think, quite wrong-headed idea that information wants to be free. I think information wants to be valued. It wants to be valued fairly. It doesn't want to be free. But the realization that the industry needs to be supported, that publishers need to get paid, that journalists need to get paid. I think that's not, that's really not been as strong in the last 10 years.
But in terms of what this means for the consumer, I mean, as a consumer, of course you want free news.
Yeah.
If I still keep wanting free news, I mean, what does that mean? How do you put the whole thing together so that the consumer gets what he or she wants?
Yeah. So our view on this is, there's actually a very simple answer to this question, and that answer is that marketplaces win. If you look at any industry, whether you're looking at buying shoes online or books or cars or music or electronics or video or anything you're looking to buy, the single best, most effective, most cost-effective, most convenient way of doing it is to do it through an online marketplace. Now, the specific implementation of those marketplaces is different. So iTunes is different from Spotify, Netflix is different from Hulu, Amazon is different from eBay. So you have a few different variations around these marketplaces. But what's common to all of them is that if you assemble enough brands, enough supply, enough choice in one location, and you make it easy and cost effective for people to access that, then that's the model that consumers will embrace.
So tell me about Inkle. I mean, what were the ideas behind it, and how did you create it?
Yeah, so the idea, look at its heart, the idea was really that advertising wasn't going to support news. And I reached that conclusion back in 2011 because, I was working for Fairfax and looking at the numbers. And there were three specific issues that I felt were structural issues that could not be, counteracted. One was the move to small screen devices. So fewer ads per page, and that was going to have a big impact on how many ads publishers had available to sell. The second was the decline in prices because of the impact of online platforms, demand-side platforms, real-time buying, in-view advertising. I mean, there's a very long list of reasons why prices have been falling in advertising for a fairly long time. And then the third one was the rise in competition. So, back in 2011, 12, I was worrying about Facebook, but then it was Snapchat, and now it's Amazon. And so when you combine those three things and you say fewer ads, so less inventory to sell, lower prices at which to sell it, and more competition out there, it became very obvious that ads would not support news and that readers would have to pay for news. And so from that, it followed, well, if readers are going to pay, then the best way for a reader to be able to pay is based on consumption, based on choice, not being locked into one title, into a fixed monthly payment. So that was really the idea behind Inkle.
And what's been the reaction to it so far in different parts of the world that you've launched?
So one of the things that's really interesting is that the problem we're trying to solve is global. And when we first launched Inkle, we thought, we'd really focus on the Australian market and try and solve the need in Australia first, and then expand into other countries. But without any really overt sort of marketing efforts by us, we've seen word of mouth take us into 186 countries around the world. And so we'll get emails, from users in places we haven't even ever heard of, and they'll be telling us about how much they enjoy Inkle and how they think it's very necessary because it's giving them this broader perspective and this more serious perspective on the news. Because I think readers, one of the things that's frustrating for readers, I think, is that they don't have a lot of spare time. Everyone's really busy these days. And so when you do look for news and you have to, wade through a lot of articles about Justin Bieber and Kim Kardashian, that's, I think, very frustrating for people. So giving them an environment without any of that sort of content, I think, is, something that appeals globally.
Well, so it's interesting because in the Philippines, most Filipinos now who are online get their news from Facebook. 97% of all the Filipinos who are online, you're talking about roughly 58 million Filipinos, 97% are on Facebook. And so that's where they get their news. In the United States, I think the last Pew survey said as much as 44% of Americans got their news from Facebook. What is the problem with getting your news from Facebook?
It's a very, very fundamental problem, right? Which is that Facebook is not a news network. And they keep saying this, and they get castigated for it. They're actually right, because Facebook is a relationship platform. It's not a dating relationship platform in the sense of a romantic relationship, but it is a relationship platform. And so if you're building a relationship platform, what you do is you try and find things that make people's bonds stronger. So you show them items of content that they will agree with, that they will both sort of, be of a mind about. And that is in many ways the very opposite of what a news publisher would try to do. I mean, you would know, right? Like you're constantly trying to expand the horizons of your readers and introduce them to new and challenging ideas. Now, if your entire goal is to just make bonds between people stronger, that is absolutely not what you would do. So I think there is a very fundamental problem, first of all, in the idea of relying just on Facebook for news, but moreover also in expecting Facebook to play that role. So, in fact, I think the only real option for Facebook here is to step further away from news, because, whether they choose to censor the news or not censor the news, they will get, criticized either way.
Yeah.
And it will not help their business position and their shareholder returns to be caught in that struggle.
It's really interesting that you said the only option for Facebook here is to step further away from news, because in a way, a lot of the problem with fake news, certainly in the Philippines, began when instant articles, when Facebook really took news in all the way. And it's so interesting, you also said, the goal of news is to expand the world of the reader. We have this struggle in news groups all the time where you give the reader what they want, the viewer what they want, which when I used to manage the largest television station here, the news group there, it was crime and entertainment. Crime and entertainment. And we always, in Rappler, we tried to balance that with what the news agenda should dictate. Like, you should know about Marawi, you should know about what's going on in Mindanao, neither of which create necessarily great engagement, right? Which is the option, which is what Facebook's algorithms optimize for. Algorithms. Sorry, long-winded way of getting to this. So we'll go back to Facebook later on, but in terms of algorithms, Inkle also uses algorithms. What's different between the algorithms of Inkle and the algorithms of the most popular social network, Facebook?
Okay. The central difference is in what we're trying to optimize for. And at its heart, any algorithm is essentially just an automated way of optimizing for a particular outcome. In the case of most of the big platforms out there, they're optimizing for one of two things. They're usually optimizing either for the direct interaction with the content, which is the number of people clicking through, because that impacts the total number of people who see ads and so on. Or they're looking for indirect interaction. What I mean by that is amplification. So a lot of the times, the story is shared because of the potential to go viral. BuzzFeed quite famously actually has built its entire business around this. So they have systems where they monitor the uptake and the interest in stories, and when they see something breaking the curve and doing better than the norm, they immediately amplify it across every platform, every outlet, because their entire goal is to drive viral consumption. So when we starting to build Inkle, our question was, well, if you go to a supermarket, the supermarket puts a lot of time and effort into thinking about what products to put in front of you that you would be willing to buy, right? And so for us, the starting point was really that question, and said, well, if you come into Inkle and you're looking to buy news, what sort of articles would you buy, would you pay for? And we straight away realized that it's not the stuff you see on Facebook, it's not the stuff you see on BuzzFeed, it's not the stuff you see on Reddit even. And so we had to build our algorithm based on news value. And so what we started by doing, we initially started by looking at articles and analyzing articles and running machine learning algorithms through them to try and understand and predict what people would be interested in. But then we realized that we'd end up creating a filter bubble, just like everyone else. I might think you're mostly interested in Filipino news, and so I just show you, local news from the Philippines, but you might still want to know about what's happening in US politics. And so in order to get that balance right, we built a system based on how publishers rank stories. So we have a system that in real time understands what the world's most experienced and trusted editors are defining as important news. And on the back of that judgment, so really that's a heuristic signal from the newsrooms, that's what we use to assess whether an article is important or not. And then we have to, of course, figure out whether it's relevant for a user. So something at the top of the Washington Post may or may not be useful for people in other parts of the world. So we have to then try and understand whether it's relevant.
How do you deal with localization? Like, for example, here in the Philippines, right? So of course I was playing with the app, and I know how it works now. But how do you, if I want Indonesian Filipinos, how do you deal with that, depending on where the person using Inkle is?
So one of the things we try to do is to understand the relationships between countries. So in the Philippines, for instance, we look at the trade balances between the Philippines and other countries. And so if we're evaluating business news, then we know that the countries that are the closest trading partners for the Philippines are where the most relevant business news is coming from. If you're looking at something like world news, that's much less of a concern because world news by definition, has a global context. If you're looking at sport, again, depending on the most widely played sports, you might find that, ice hockey from Canada is absolutely not of interest in the Philippines, right? So part of what we try to do is understand the context within readers in each country, evaluate news from other parts of the world, and then we try and show that balance and that mix of local, national, and international news.
Fantastic. Let me ask you about, you talked about the filter bubble, and one of the first guys to actually write or talk about this was Eli Pariser. Remember the echo chambers? That was the first time. The filter bubbles that he had. Our platform, Where Filipinos Are, Facebook, definitely has created these very different echo chambers and created a very polarized society. How can Inkle do anything? I mean, how do we deal with filter bubbles? What's the right way? How do you see it playing out?
I think you have to undercut the business model, right? The business model for filter bubbles is entirely based on free ad views, right? So the reason why a lot of this polarization is happening is because of very incendiary publications that have no real interest in propagating information and understanding. Fake news ultimately is created by organizations for one of two reasons, right? Either they have some sort of propagandist objective, so there's some sort of political objective that they're pursuing, or it's a pure commercial enterprise. And so if you can undermine or undercut one or both of those incentives, then I think that's the answer right now. So to a certain extent, there are movements out there like this one around sleeping giants where you sort of make companies aware when their ads are placed on content that is fake or, of disrepute. That sort of initiative, I think, is very valuable. I think the industry, the ad industry and agencies globally are looking at how they can be more careful about where their ads are placed. So I think those sorts of initiatives will help because ultimately, if you can't make money off just writing nonsense and fake news, then, fewer people will do it.
No, that's actually true. But it seems like from businesses to platforms, it's become a far more opportunistic world that really seems to prey on the worst of human nature. How would you handle this? I mean, how do you? I saw, by the way, you announced that you took down your Facebook app. But give us, if you're a normal consumer, if you're a normal person, how do we deal with this? Obviously, the advertisers, this isn't all going to change overnight. How do we survive between now and a world where the path is a little bit clearer?
So it's really interesting because before he left office, President Barack Obama was actually talking about precisely this problem. And he was describing the need for what he called a safe space to read the news. Right. And so to a large extent, I took that as a very, interesting visionary statement because in many ways that is really what we are trying to create with Inkle. It's a safe space to read the news where you can get news from different locations on different perspectives, different takes on the news. Without worrying about whether someone is writing something just to mislead you. I mentioned this, I think, when we last spoke, which when people talk about fake news, a lot of the debate is usually about identifying whether a particular article is fake or not. Right. Now, that's a very hard thing to do because news is often produced in the fog of war. Yeah. So you find out afterwards whether it was fake or not. There are often, sort of earnest, mistakes made in the process. So what we found is that if you create a space where you're selective about the news organizations you bring in, that actually becomes a much better predictor for the authenticity and the reliability of the news coverage you provide. So Rappler, for instance, if from time to time you guys have written something and you find out later on that actually that wasn't correct, I'm sure you will immediately put out a correction and a retraction and make sure people understand that.
Correct.
Whereas organizations that intentionally produce fake news never do that. So I think we can help with that because, in Inkle, first of all, we're selective about the publishers. But the second thing we did is we created a feature called Dive Deeper. And what Dive Deeper does is below each article, we will show you 5 other perspectives on that same article. And where this becomes really interesting, I mean, politics is obviously one context for a lot of the fake news discussion, but it's really interesting if you apply it to things like sport.
Right.
If you watch matches played between countries, you may watch a Brazil-Argentina football match, the Brazilian publications and the Argentinian publications will describe that match in such drastically different terms that it'll sound like two different matches. We see this here when Australia plays cricket with India or with the UK. So, that was really for us the initial idea behind Dive Deeper was that, well, let's make sure we're giving you those disparate perspectives so you really understand what's happening.
Fantastic. So for those of you guys who are watching, Inkle is coming into the Philippines. Rappler is a partner of Inkle. You can actually, and I'll talk through, Gautam, the pricing point that we're talking about here. You can come at it and get a one-time monthly fee of 599 pesos a month or 4 pesos per article. Gautam, what do you get for that?
So for 599 pesos a month, you're getting unlimited access to everything on the platform. For 4 pesos an article, you can read as much or as little as you want. You're not locked into any sort of monthly subscription. There are no lock-ins anywhere on Inkle, so you can cancel whenever you want. And on the platform, we have really about 50 of the world's best titles. So we've got Rappler, of course. We've got publishers like Bloomberg, Business Week, The Washington Post, The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, Straits Times, Financial Times, Foreign Policy. And really at this point, and I think certainly more so into the future, a lot of these publications will have their own subscriptions as well. So for a lot of readers, this is actually a good way to get access to a very broad array of content, because if you try to go out and subscribe individually to every subscription, you would probably end up paying $1,000 a month. Whereas for most people, we find that they end up wanting to read maybe 30 or 40 articles a month. And so it's a really affordable way to do that.
Let's talk again and pull it out. How do you see news after we get through this time of disruption? You see opportunity. Most people running newsrooms are actually looking at the duopoly of Google and Facebook coming in and taking the lion's share of digital revenues. I think in the United States, all new digital ad spend, 99% of all new digital ad spend are going to the two tech giants. In the Philippines, we're roughly at about 80-85% this year.
Yeah.
Where do you see this going? How do you see publishers reacting to it?
So I think one of the things that's going to happen is that 2-horse race is going to become a 3-horse race. And then eventually it'll become a 1-horse race, because I think Amazon ultimately will win. A lot of people don't realize that Amazon's already making $1.5 billion a year in ad revenue. That's 4 times the amount of money that Snapchat made. And Snapchat is a company with a $25 billion valuation. So, sort of in a course of a year or two, Amazon has built essentially a $100 billion ad revenue business. And given that Amazon ultimately has such in-depth analysis and understanding of its customers, it can take advertiser return on investment to a place where even Facebook and Google can't. Facebook's big advantage over the publishers, obviously, is that they can say, look, if you want to reach 23-year-old women, we can target, just that population and show your ad just to them. So you're not wasting any money reaching anyone other than 23-year-old women. But what Amazon ultimately can do is they can say, well, you think you want to advertise to 23-year-old women, but we know there's a group of 25-year-old men and 21-year-old women who also want to buy this product, and we will make sure that they see the product because they understand actual purchase behavior, right? And they've got purchase data. So I think what will happen is both Facebook and Google will start to have to play defense a lot more, right? I think they're going to have to look at their core product. And I think to a certain extent that's useful because, they will stop, focusing as much on some of the other industries and some of the other problems, news industry being one of those. And at the same time, I also think the news industry is going to change quite dramatically in the next 2 to 3 years, where it will essentially split. And you'll end up with your low-cost, high-volume, low-quality providers. There will always be Daily Mails in the world, right? And, Viral Nova and Clickhole and all those kinds of websites. I don't think they're going anywhere. But the ability to get that content in the same place where you get high-quality content, that is going to go away. So I think publishers at the other end of the spectrum who invest in creating really high-quality content will start to become a lot more selective about distribution. So content will start to be more scarce. And out of that scarcity, you will end up with an equilibrium point where people are willing to pay enough to sustain, and satisfy the cost of producing that content.
How interesting. So what you're describing is really a tech battle. If you're a news manager, how do we get from here to a safer space, right? Do we jump into the tech battle? How do you see that? How do we?
I wouldn't jump into the tech battle because I don't think there's, I don't think there's a win in that particular battle for the publishers themselves. I would instead, decrease reliance on any of those platforms. So I would look at decreasing reliance on Facebook and Google, and I would do that by thinking more about distribution channels. Banks are a very good example of this because banks learned very, very long ago that you have to have lots of different distribution channels. So most banks will sell you products in the branches, online, in supermarkets, through other channels, other affiliates, right? And what you get and the price you pay and the brands you see, those might be different.
Yeah.
But they have very sophisticated multi-channel distribution strategies. And this is where publishers need to go. Instead of just saying, I have to get my content out there and reach as many readers as I can, I think publishers will start to say, well, who are my most valuable readers? Who's willing to pay for the content? Who gets the most out of the content? And how do I deliver more value to them? And then that will naturally lead to a reduced emphasis on things like Facebook and Google. And I think ultimately publishers will start to think about, what's the average revenue per user, and how do you increase that revenue per user? So can you convince someone to pay for one article? Can you convince someone to become a member or make a one-off donation or take a subscription or buy a bundle? And as publishers focus more and more on that direct purchase relationship with readers, I think a lot of these issues around third-party distribution, with Facebook and Google, I think those will start to ease off.
Let's talk about how the role journalists play in society. I mean, in many ways, part of the problem when you do get news for free, and we're coming from this area where news groups are selling based on credibility and brand that we took decades to build, right? And now you're in this kind of morass where it's just a popularity war inside these platforms. How do you see the role of journalists and news groups changing in our societies from when you were head of strategy of Fairfax to the future that you see taking in present day?
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's already changed a lot in the last 5 years, right? I mean, it started off, obviously, the journalist sort of ethos was, you produce the facts and you make sure you always verify the facts and you report the facts. And you let the reader or the audience come to their own conclusions about, how they want to evaluate those facts. Whereas these days, the fact base is so big and so overwhelming that journalists have assumed the role of interpreter. And so most journalists these days, will write not just the facts, but they will also provide their own analysis and opinion and commentary on those facts. So to a certain extent, I think, that change has already happened. I don't necessarily see that going away, because I do think that the world every day will continue to become more complex and faster, and that translation or that interpretation is a valuable service. But I think the incentives around some of that analysis, as those incentives change, the analysis and the opinions will be more directed at what's best for the reader.
Right.
Whereas at the moment, there is a lot of conflict of interest in a lot of different parts of the industry.
Yes. When you say what's best for the reader, again, you go back. I actually say, oftentimes what the reader wants is our empty calorie sugar, entertainment. Yeah. We see it in television ratings. We see it in. So if they want sugar and we think they should have vegetables, I mean, where's the role of the gatekeeper, the traditional news role of gatekeeper?
Yeah. So the point ultimately is that I think if anyone was on a 100% sugar diet, they won't live very long. Right, and I think that applies to readers as well. You can put your readers on a hardcore sugar diet, but you're not going to retain them very long because sugar hits don't last that long. So people will come to you initially and they'll be very pleased with the experience, but within 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, they'll get bored of that and they'll go away, and they will return to other sources where they get something more sustaining. They get the vitamins and the vegetables and the fruit and the other food groups, and so. I think to a certain extent, if you just take that long-term view and you sort of think about the reader relationship in the long term rather than about optimizing and maximizing ad revenue in the quarter, I think that naturally leads itself to publishers providing more sustainable, form of news and more sustainable mix of news. One of the things that I think, quite interesting is that, you do have to have obviously entertainment, right? And I don't think there's a problem per se with people spending time, reading about TV shows or celebrities or, what have you, but in balance, right? And I think people understand that. And one of the really interesting things that I think is going to become a bigger issue in the future is this need for personal media planning. One of the things that's hard at the moment is deciding how to spend your disposable free time. Do you spend it watching TV or movies or reading books or listening to podcasts or listening to music? Because nobody, or playing video games or on social media, nobody has enough time to do all of these things. And so as individuals start to find that they have to take more responsibility and more overt responsibility in managing their media diet and their, their free time, they will revert more and more to serious news as well.
I always say this every time I speak with you. I hope your prediction about the future is always right. I mean, the final question before I ask you your last thoughts are, news is always about credibility, and that's what we serve our society, and credibility is the commodity of news. Does credibility sell?
Yes, absolutely. At the end of the day, if you look at the performance of paywalls, right? So if you look around the world at the performance of paywalls for various publishers, the thing that becomes really obvious is that the publishers who have managed to make the paywalls work and have stuck with the publishers are the ones with the greatest credibility, right? In the US, for instance, there were a lot of other publishers who tried charging for news and then ended up ultimately discarding those plans because they found that the brand did not have the credibility to pull that off. So I think that credibility is not going anywhere, and I think as publishers invest more and more in that credibility, in the content quality and the experience, I think it will become more of a central differentiator for publishers like Rappler and others around the world.
Any advice for publishers like us in a country where our press freedom is narrowing? We're seeing this in a lot of other countries around the world where President Trump attacks American media, President Duterte attacks Filipino media, and what we're seeing is a concerted action to make journalists toe the line. What advice would you give?
And the pen is mightier than the sword. Hit back.
Definitely, we do the stories, and we'll continue doing the stories. But what about, again, in an era where Facebook really dominates our landscape? What we're doing with Inkle is a first step. And by the way, our viewers, if you want to support Rappler, if you want to support credible news, this is what we believe will take us forward. But in terms of getting from Facebook to Inkle, advice, Gautam?
Look, I think the key is just strengthen those relationships, focus on the reader, and think about that long-term relationship. And also, I think don't be afraid to, just speak plainly with the reader, because as much as I think readers have started to understand the issues in the industry, I think a lot of people still don't understand the issues around scarcity of journalists. Most people think the news is ubiquitous and news is everywhere, but the number of people writing and doing original reporting is actually very, very small and shrinking every year.
Shrinking, correct.
Everyone else is essentially just rewriting and piggybacking off the work of this number of journalists. And I think if readers understand that, I think they will naturally be more inclined and more willing to support. So for me, it would be, just focus on the readers, try and build that, sort of transactional or kind of, commercial relationship with the reader. And just double down, go for it.
Fantastic. Last thoughts? Any last thoughts?
No, I think the main thing is just that, the industry, I guess the world at large for the last 20 years, ever since, in California, in, the 1980s, someone said information wants to be free, we have treated news like a commodity. And the problem is that when you treat something like a commodity that is not, in fact, a commodity, you find out the hard way. So if you treat information and transparency and accountability as a valueless commodity, then you get bad outcomes. And I think, people are starting to understand that, but I fear there will be a bit more pain in various other parts of the world before we, get through it all.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. We've been speaking with Gautam Mishra. You can catch him on Twitter. It's at gmish. You can follow the Rappler.com account. And he is the founder of Inkle. It is on, actually, if you go on the page, you can download it for Google, for Android and Apple. So we are online. Continue throwing questions about the future of news. This guy's one of the smartest guys to think about it. Thanks so much for your thoughts, Gautam.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.